Well, having lived now in Gainesville for about 8.5 years, I think, or 9 years, something like that, it's fine that it's interesting being around so many young people, running into them all the time. You see that if you've lived here a long time, you've kind of see the changes in young people over time. And one of the interesting changes that is a phenomenon today that isn't helping our young people is the concept of the helicopter parent. The parent who will swoop down in and save every problem, never wants their child to experience anything bad, will always save them. Well, it's creating a generation that isn't prepared to handle the struggles of this world, and it's creating a lot of crisis in people's lives. And because of this, you get some interesting dynamics of children are afraid to disappoint their parents, and they come up with unique ways to try and soften the blows when things go wrong. See, there's this one college student that was writing home to her parents near the end of the first semester, kind of much like we are today. We're about half through the halfway point. Another month, they'll be coming into finals, and it was her first year at college. So she wrote to her parents this letter. She says, "Dear Mom and Dad, sorry I failed to write all semester, but college life has kept me really busy. About 2 months ago, I was slightly injured in a car accident near the shopping mall. The injuries were not too serious, and the paramedic was really nice. We went out a few times, and he invited me to move in with him, which sure beats dorm life a lot. He's extremely smart, even though he's dropped out of high school. I really like his long hair and tattoos. The weekends are a real blast when we get high on drugs. I especially hope you like him since I may be expecting our first child soon. Love, your daughter." And at the bottom was a little P.S., and in parentheses was over, and she'd written some more stuff on the other side. And on the other side was written these words, P.S., there was no accident, no paramedic, no love affair, no drugs, and no baby. However, I am anticipating getting 2 D's and 1 F this semester. When my grades arrive, I wanted you to have things in their proper perspective. Trying to put things in their proper perspective. I think that's what was facing Job. He didn't know how to put things in their proper perspective. We hear all the time that, well, somebody has it worse than you. Of course, sometimes you think there can't be anybody who has it worse than me. You have a hard time finding them, and you begin to just question. And this is where Job was. We all hear of the patience of Job. Well, we've gone long past the patience of Job. Job has gone from patience to frustration to now he's just persevering through it. He doesn't know when this is going to end, how it's going to end, and he just wants to ask God one question: why? Why is this happening? And if we pick up from where we left off last week, we see that in chapter 24, Job begins to account that so many injustices are in this world. And we can sit there when we're having problems and look all over the world and see all the things that are wrong. And we begin to ask God, why are you allowing all these wrongs to go on? And if you read the newspaper at all, I read multiple newspapers every week. There's a lot of hurt and pain and injustice in this world. There's a lot of evil that seems to be having its way. And it's the biggest question that confronts us as believers is how can a loving God allow all of this to happen? And Job recounts all these injustices that are happening. And then in Job, in chapter 26, Job does acknowledge that God is omnipotent, that God is all-powerful, and this just frustrates Job even more. He never denies God's presence. He never denies God's power. That is what's confusing, that if God is all power, he can fix this. He can surely fix this, and why does he delay? Why does he not answer my call? And so from chapters 27 to 31, Job just goes on and on and on for 4 chapters about his complaint. You can read it if you would like to later. And then Job's friends, we talked a little bit them last week. They spend the next 5 chapters telling Job how it's all his fault. And that God is good and God would never do anything like that and you must have done something like that. Isn't this the kind of friends you really want to have around with you when life is bad and they're just kicking you while you're down, telling you, does that, I've always wondered, what is a true friend? Rudyard Kipling spoke about friendship, what really true friendship is. I don't know if you've ever read his poem, The Thousandth Man. It's based on Solomon's writings in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon says there's only but 1 in 1,000 that gets it right. And so Rudyard Kipling takes on this concept of that friend who's that 1 in 1,000. And I love how this one verse goes. His wrongs, your wrong. His rights, your right. 999 can't bide the shame or mocking or laughter. But the 1,000th man will stand by your side to the gallows foot and after. See, there's that true friend who, if you're wrong, well, I'm going to be wrong with you. I'll just sit here, and if you want to believe the sky is yellow or green or purple and the moon comes out orange, whatever today, and it's not out, I will be with you because you're my friend, and I will stand in all your wrongness. And I'm not ashamed that you're my friend. Job's friends could not stand the shame of their friends suffering this. They couldn't take it. They couldn't understand how a good God would allow it. And so they just questioned it. And so it is in chapter 37 that we pick up this morning, where Job's friends have completed their defense of God's righteousness. And I think we get into more trouble trying to defend God than just letting God be God and just letting our actions and our loving the people. So God now comes to Job. And God's going to address both Job and his friends, but he starts with Job. And you heard that phrase in there, gird up your loins. Today's vernacular would be more like, it's time to man up, Job. It's time to be a man. Gird up your loins was the way, if you were preparing for battle, you couldn't do it in a long flowing toga. You had to kind of pull the ends up and tuck them in your belt so you could run around and get ready to fight, because God says, man up, we're about to do some battle. And he begins to question him. And if you read it, there are some 80 questions God asked Job, and he can't answer a single one of them. And I love that. When God appears, he's like Christ would do. Whenever we read in the gospel, someone come and ask Christ a question, Christ would never answer them. He would always answer with a question. And that's what God did to Job. He says, who is this? Who are you? Do you know all these things? He answered with questions so that we could begin to search in ourselves. I've always found it interesting that when I've talked to counselors before, they go, we don't have the answers. The answer's already inside the person. Our job is just to get them to listen to it, is to help them to slow the thoughts down a little bit so that they can hear the solution themselves. We don't give the solution. And that's what God's doing. He's helping to Job slow down, and he's acknowledging it. But our problem is we so often today come to God as the accuser instead of the accused. C.S. Lewis put this many years ago. He said, the ancient man approached God as the accused person approaches a judge. But for the modern person, the roles are reversed. We are the judges. We put God on trial. And we dare say to God in the midst of our struggle, by the way, God, if you would oblige yourself to explain suffering, pain, war, death, and disease, and you give an adequate explanation to all that I'm giving you, that I'm going through, I might give you the honor of a little bit of my attention and my devotion. See, we reverse the roles so often when we get in trouble and we complain to God, is we go to God as the accuser and judge, and God as the accused. Now, Job was not demanding God answer his questions so that he would follow him. He was already following him. But he wanted to know why. And it's a critical question many people have, and we shouldn't brush that question off too easily or lightly. Because our problem is, how do we make sense of God's will when so many things in this world go wrong, so many problems come up? And there are problems in this congregation today. There are people who are struggling with things that have happened to them. And this week has been a pretty tough week for me in dealing with some people. Living here in Gainesville as a pastor, I get calls from other pastors around the state because Shands attracts a lot of specialty work. And so congregation members come here to get things, and they don't have a pastor nearby, and so they'll call the pastors here, and we'll go by and see them. And a lady who I've been working with for about 2-3 years now, she has terrible things going wrong with her. When I first met her, they were coming up here because she was coughing up blood everywhere. She was bleeding inside. She had infection in her bone. She had this, and they said, well, if we lop your leg off, it'll get rid of the infection. Well, they took her leg off, and it didn't get rid of the infection, and things get worse. And for the last 3 years, she's been in severe pain. She can't quit work because she'll lose her insurance. She keeps going to the doctors and saying, what am I to do? You tell me to quit work, but if I quit work, I lose your care. If I do this, her coworkers just come to her and say, why don't you just kill yourself? Good friends. And so Marilyn and I went and had dinner with her to try and just let her vent. And also this week, I visited another person in a nursing home who's recovering there. And she's younger because she doesn't qualify for Medicaid yet, and so her insurance has said, we're not going to pay for any more therapy, and she's lamenting, am I going to sit in this bed the rest of my life? Because nobody cares. And you sit there and listen to these things, and you don't have an answer for either one. And both of these, like Job, were strong believers. But were being pushed in their pain to wonder, where is God? Leslie Weatherhead wondered this thing. He was a pastor in London during World War II. And as he watched the bombings going on in London, and he watched the lives being destroyed and the innocent lives being taken, he began to wonder, where is God's will in this? And he wrote a wonderful little book called The Will of God. And it's based on a sermon he preached to how do we understand God's will when all this stuff happens. He says, after all, God has allowed this to happen. So what is his will? And Weatherhead came up with breaking God's wills down into 3 different components. And these are still talked by theologians today as a good understanding of God's will for us. And the first thing he says is there's God's ultimate will. In a perfect world, this is how God would have things be. This is the desires of God's heart, his ideal plan flowing out of his goodness. But the problem is there's sin in the world, he said. And so he said there's God's circumstantial or permissive will. And this, he says, is what God will allow based on us. What he will accept given our choices, the choices we as people make, in the particular circumstances, so as not to limit our free will. God allows things to happen so that he doesn't limit our free will, that he doesn't allow us to stop making the wonderful choices that we can make and the bad choices we make. But he says then there's finally God's final will. And this is how God achieves his ends. No matter what we are doing, God will take all this that's happening and work his will, his ideal will, his ultimate will out. He takes what is going on and he makes his will happen. He allows us to suffer sometimes so that we might help others. He allows us to learn things so that in learning things, others are benefiting. One of the things I try and do when I go to hospitals, and there are so many wonderful procedures out there today. I mean, think about heart transplants, heart catheterizations, and other things like that. And I tell the people who are in the hospital today, you are benefiting from the misery people 30 years ago went through because people were experimenting on them, trying to figure out how to make this work. Well, now there are things going on with you that they don't know. But they're learning, and a future generation will benefit from you. I remember visiting someone who had lung cancer, and it was pretty bad, far gone long in severity. And he says, the doctors wanted to have me do chemo and treatment, but I just think I just want to let it go and run its course because I'm kind of tired. He says, tell me, why should I do it? So I said, okay, I'll give you 2 reasons why you should do it. First, it might work. I had a lady one time who had ovarian cancer. By the time they diagnosed ovarian cancer, it's almost too late. And she wanted to just let it run its course. The doctor said, okay, we'll try this. And she said, why I do? Well, it said it'll probably alleviate your pain. So she said, okay. Well, it actually cured it. It surprised the doctors and everybody that it cured it. I said, we try some things because they might work. But the second more important thing is the doctor will learn something from you. The doctor will learn something from your pain that will help somebody down. And that was the ultimate reason he decided to go through treatment, and he's happy now. Even though he's dying, there's a joy with him because he's put it in the proper perspective. See, C.S. Lewis in his book, The Problem with Praying, put it this way in helping us to understand God's will. He said, by the goodness of God, we mean nowadays almost exclusively his lovingness. And in this, we may be right. And by love, most of us mean kindness, the desire to see others well, happy. What would really satisfy us would be a God who said, of anything we happen to like doing, what does it matter so long as they are contented? He said, we want, in fact, not so much a Father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, a senile benevolence who, as they say, liked to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said, at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. I should very much like to live in a universe which was governed on such lines. But since it is abundantly clear that I don't, and since I have reason to believe, nevertheless, that God is love, I conclude that my conception of love needs correction. What does it mean that God loves us when all these things are going wrong? And see, we have to remember that God's ideal plan for us is not for this world. It's for our relationship with him. To love him, to be in one with him, to be so close up that nothing else matters. And that God is creating a new heaven and a new earth for us. But in the meantime, we're going to walk through some stuff. And when God addresses Job and asks him, do you know my ways? And asks him these 80 questions, Job can only lower his head and say, I spoke without knowing. The terrible truth in this world is that people don't notice Christians when they're happy. People only notice Christians when they're suffering. That's the strange world we live in. And so God, through the years, has allowed horrible suffering by Christians because when we persevere through them, people take notice. The early church, the first 300 years of Christianity, when it was illegal to be a church, grew more and faster than any other time in history because the people saw the way they lived their lives and said, I want what you want. And that woman that I had dinner with, I tell you that all her friends tell her she ought to commit herself. While we were at dinner, she shared this story, because there are days that she wishes she was dead. And she almost got her wish one day. She was meeting somebody. She's a certified counselor and all that, and was meeting with another counselor to talk some things at a school. And coming out of the school, it was pouring down rain like that. She coded out. She just collapsed on the floor and coded out. And the paramedics were called, and the paramedics came there and revived her and were working on her. And they got her back out. She says, the next thing I know, I'm woken up in the ICU. And there's this guy sitting there next to me. And he finally gets up and says he has to leave. And the nurse comes in and says, well, your brother's gone now. And she's like, I don't have a brother here. And she said, well, the paramedic there that left, I thought he was your brother. He's been here the whole time. And then the other two paramedics that were with this guy came in and talked to her and kind of helped fill in. And they said, you know, we have been working on our friend for years to understand what Christianity is. That night when you were lying in the rain, dying, you were sharing Christ to him. You were more concerned about him being in the rain than you dying. She goes, I don't remember that. She said, you've brought him closer to God than anybody ever has. God uses our pain. In the 55th chapter of Isaiah, verses 8 and 9, it's written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, said the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God does not cause us the pain, the trouble, but he uses it. He uses it in wonderful ways if we'll allow it to be used. I close with somebody you know. I didn't know Clarence was going to be here. But Clarence shared something. As you know, Marie Witt, for the last 5 years, has been dealing with a lot of stuff. And Clarence says, I would have never wished that on her. He didn't say it exactly, but that's kind of his words. He wouldn't have wished that on anybody. But he said, these last 5 years, we have grown closer to each other than I could have ever imagined. And I wouldn't take that closeness away for anything. God uses the pain. God uses the suffering for his ultimate will, for us to come closer to one another, for us to come closer to God. And when we can put it in the proper perspective, it begins to make a little sense. Not complete sense. Pain will never make sense to me. But when we get on that road asking, why, we need to pause sometimes and ask ourselves, are my plans for my life bigger than God's plans for my life are? Am I going to let the temporary push out the eternal? Or am I going to submit to God's love and see how he's going to use me? See, God's plan is eternal. And we're called to come together and to help one another in times of trouble, to walk. Not like Job's friends kicking each other. And churches sometimes are bad about that. We can be mean instead of loving. We need to put it back into proper perspective and lift one another up. And this morning I found a need in our church that just walked in the door. We have a gentleman who's trying to get to Pensacola and he needs $100. And I hope that we can help him. That a few people, it's just $5 for everybody here. If y'all can help me, just see me. And we can help a young man go to see his daughter. Let us pray.